I mean, his whole face.
Alan would know him because he was in jail. That's what you started with.
Really.
Why are you responding this way? Because this is not a big deal.
Like, I don't care about your feelings. I need you to perform.
Oh my gosh. I was...
What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Patros podcast as we embrace healthy masculinity. My name is Alan Pereira. This is Jeff Ford.
You're such a pro at it now.
Look at that.
Man.
Yeah,
so proud
we're getting
of you.
better here. And then we have a special guest today. Who do we have with us, Jeff?
Well, we have a special guest. We haven't had many women on the show. And so...
And according to our rules, you are the most prized treasure.
You are the most prized and treasured female guest we've ever had.
Do you tell everything you guess that?
Whoever
We
sits in
maybe.
Oh, okay.
But for today, you are definitely the most prized and treasured
Wonderful.
female guest we've ever had.
I feel it. I really feel
See?
it.
That's all that matters. So we have with us Lainey Gibney. Lainey is, I'll let you introduce yourself, but for our purposes here, she sits on the Man Up board. And we only have a few females that are on the Man Up board. And I think since you have graced us with your presence, we have been able to think younger. We've been able to think, I think, more like contemporary in a way that is actually meaningful to the culture. And I think like you're constantly challenging us to make sure that we're thinking like how we're thinking when we present ourselves forward facing, whether it's our website, Instagram, whatever the case may be. So that we're actually making an impact. Because what's the point of being on social media or anything else if you're not making an impact? So, and I think what we all love about you, Lainey, is that you are free to speak your mind. And we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially on a podcast.
Sometimes that's not a compliment when people say that to me.
You know what? In this case, total compliment.
Thank you.
But we're having you on today, and I'll let you introduce yourself, but we're having you on today because we are going to be talking about trauma. Mm-hmm. And, in the world that we live in, trauma is like the thing right now. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it comes from the research that Karen Purvis did at TCU with the trust-based relational intervention model, which a lot of folks use the TBRI model, ourselves included, in kind of dealing with those from trauma. But I think, when I was growing up, if you saw somebody acting out, you just were like, well, they're a bad kid.
Right.
Right. And you guys, because you guys are kind of the same generation, you've had the opportunity to grow up in an environment where that's changed and is changing.
More informed.
Continually, yeah.
Much more informed now. Yeah. And so you're a licensed social worker.
Licensed clinical social worker.
Bam.
Yes.
And so, wait, what did you say?
LCSW, right?
Man.
Yeah.
That's your letters? Yeah.
That's my letters.
You guys are so informed. So you have the distinct pleasure of having a history in this. And that's why we wanted to bring you on because in our spheres, you're one of the most knowledgeable that we know. So tell us a little bit about yourself and why this work in like clinical social work and trauma and et cetera.
Yeah. Well, I guess, should I start professionally at the beginning? Like where should I even start with this?
When you were born.
Wow.
Wherever you want to take us.
Well, I will say I grew up in a wonderful Christian home, 2 parents that stayed married, loved each other. I had a brother. We all have really great relationships. If you were to ask me at any point in my childhood, teenagehood, young adult life, did you experience trauma as a child? I might have looked at you sideways. Like, what even is that? What is childhood trauma? I don't think I even knew what it was. I was so sheltered from the realities of our world growing up. So I was dead set on being a nurse when I grew up. And I got into nursing school. I got into a interesting relationship, which caused a lot of stress in my life. I ended up failing out of nursing school, highly unlike me. And I got to a place where I had no direction on what I was going to do with my life. I hadn't thought of a plan B. I was always going to be a nurse. I didn't know what else to do. And I sat down with the dean of nursing school and I told her, I said, I just want to help people. I can't be a nurse anymore, but I just really want to help people that are hurting. And I want to help people in their deepest times of need, but I don't know what label that is. I don't know what to call that. And she said, have you ever considered social work? And I had never even heard of social work. Like, that's how sheltered I was. I didn't even know what a social worker was. So I looked into it because I felt I didn't have any other options. And
you're like, I hope this pays.
I'm like, please,
something.
please let it work. So I took a couple classes and I aced them. I was flying through them. I loved, like, I was the kid that was like jumping out of bed ready for class. And I loved social work. I took so many diverse classes on, there's just like there's so many options. Yeah. But I really honed in on a family violence and child abuse class, which again, I think it was just one of those things that opened my eyes and I realized there's this giant need. And people, I remember reading about family violence and about domestic violence and child neglect. I mean, we got into the dirty examples of the pain that people go through. And I remember sitting in this class like, there's no way people experience this. Like, there's no way. And I remember my classmates raising their hands and sharing personal stories from their childhoods. Wow. And I was floored that people had this level of trauma in their lives and they were sitting right around me.
And you're growing up in a, 2-parent household. You go to church every week. Yeah. You always got a roof over your head, never starved.
We were never food insecure. Yeah. My father never laid a hand on my mom. There was, if they argued, it was what I would think is very healthy marital arguments. And I was just so amazed that people could walk through these really, really dark situations and experience so much trauma. But I also saw my classmates around me. They taught me so much because I thought, well, you're sitting here becoming a social worker to then pour out to other people and help other people. So there has to be hope in this situation. Even before I was thinking of it in a Christ-like filter, I thought there has to be hope for people that are walking through these types of situations.
That's good.
Man, really good. So you've been doing this kind of work now for how long?
Well, I graduated in 2015. So if that tells you how old I am. I don't know if I just sometimes I feel like I discredit myself because that feels a little young. But I've been in the field for 9 years.
For almost a decade.
Yeah, almost a decade.
That's a long time to be in a particular field, especially among y'all's generation.
10 years,
y'all switch jobs.
That's expertise. You become a subject matter expert 10 years.
Is that a fact?
Is that a thing?
Well, 10,000 hours typically will take you around 10 years to do your 10,000 reps.
You know more like random facts.
Or he just says it with such confidence.
That's what I'm saying.
That you
sometimes I'm like, he just
true.
makes
It's
stuff
layered.
up.
It's multi-layered. But
like, you probably heard that from 3 sources and put it together.
No, you have 365 days a year. If you even just do 3 hours a day, that's 1,000, right? That'd be 10,000.
I'm out on math. That's why I like to say I'm a social worker. I didn't take a math class.
You easily hit 1,000 hours a year. So 10 years.
You amaze me. So let's chat about trauma itself, because I think that this has been one of the most eye-opening things for me, is to see, to your point, how people actually live.
Yeah.
Because when you grow up in a Christian home, and the Patros podcast speaks mainly to, I think, men in the church who have a churchy background or a Christian background, but there may be many of you who are not. But I think when you grow up in the church, it's been sanitized. Right. And you kind of are growing up with people that look like you, think like you, et cetera. And then when they don't, they're trying to cover it up because they don't want to be called out.
Right.
Because, church is a place for people to be, clean and healthy, not sick, even though that's what church is for the sick.
Right.
So maybe let's start there. Like what in the church in particular, was this idea of trauma ever talked about? Were you surprised at the lack of resources in the church? Like, how did the church play a role in all this for you as you learned what trauma was and how to deal with it?
I don't ever recall a moment growing up in church that I was taught about trauma. I don't know that that word was ever even brought up. And without getting too personal here, I think that that is one of the reasons that I found myself in a very traumatic relationship at 19 years old.
Because you couldn't see red flags.
I had no words for it. I had no vocabulary for it.
Yeah.
I had no definitions for it. So it wasn't until 2 years after I left that relationship that I read in one of my textbooks what a domestic violence relationship was. And I remember looking at those words and going, oh my gosh, I was in an abusive relationship.
Wow.
Like those were the words. It took a college secular textbook to teach me what trauma was. Yeah.
Wow.
And I remember also in learning about social work, the I guess root of social work is to meet the needs of those who are in need. That's what we do. We go to the place of need. We meet the person where they're at. We are focused on what they need, and we get them whatever resources or help they need to heal. And I also remember sitting in those classes going, wait a second, the church is the original social workers.
Yeah.
Like, how crazy is this that we have whole secular institutions that are teaching people how to do what the church should be doing.
Yeah.
And that really struck me. But no, I don't recall learning these types of things in church ever.
Yeah, and the church does, right? The church meets needs all the time.
Right.
And we believe that the church is the hope of the world. So obviously they should be, and the church is doing what secular government could never do.
Yeah,
in
course.
fact, in the state of Florida, there is a huge push, and this is around the country. But seeing as how we're filming here in Florida, there is a huge push from the government to say, we can't do it.
Right.
Like we need
churches, we need you.
We need you to step up. We need the faith community, and of course, they're as a state entity, they're going to include all faiths, and that's
for sure
cool. But as a church, as a Christian church, there is an opportunity, and I think that the government is wising up to this. That they're realizing, okay, we cannot exclude this large portion of the population who, by the way, they're like the marching orders from the manual says you need to be meeting needs.
Right.
So it's like they're like, okay, we need a partnership here. It's interesting because you talked about how you didn't even you had to read that textbook and that gave you the language and the vocabulary. We had a domestic violence training last week, and we're listening to this domestic violence training from the state. It was like a state mandated thing, which was what it was. But there was one gal who she was talking about. She was using language around what an abuser will do, and this was specifically related to intimate partner violence, is what they called it. And so it was just using like it starts subtly, and then the abuser is really that goal of that individual is to have control and to maintain control at all times.
Yeah.
And so you use subtle language, gaslighting, which maybe we can talk about in a bit. Like what exactly is that?
Hot button word these days.
Oh, yeah.
DARVO, which is another one, like deny, attack, reverse, victim. I think that's what it stands for. But like she's using this language, and then she's talking about how they'll use things to maintain the leverage of power in the relationship. So like, for instance, a picture in a compromising position that they'll then use, well, I'm going to send this to all your coworkers if you try to do X, Y, and Z. And then in that conversation, she talked about spiritual abuse. And it was interesting to me that the secular state is talking about spiritual abuse. That tells me that they must be finding it often if they're going to put it on the slide. So abuse comes in a lot of different ways, which then translates to trauma. So I think my question for you, kind of the next evolution of this would be, what are the causes of trauma? What are the things that are more prominent that you've seen in working with, because you've worked with hundreds of kids in that setting, trying to help them work through this. What do you see, and what are those causes?
Yeah. For the sake of context, I've been working in the context of the Department of Children and Families I've been in the school system for several years, and now on the church side of things, where I really see, I don't work directly client to client, but I see a lot working in the church. When you ask what causes trauma, it sounds like such a simple question, but of course, with everything trauma, there is no simple answer. Trauma is so complex, and what makes it so complex is that there's not a list of things that cause trauma. Because trauma is not the trigger, or trauma is not the situation or the experience. Trauma is how the individual responds to that experience or situation. So when you have, a million people in a lineup, you could have a million different definitions of trauma.
Because you could have like the same situation, like Al and I could go through the same situation, and it's not traumatic for him, it is for me, or vice versa.
Right.
But so that's one of the things I'd like to do is define trauma as best as possible for the sake of good conversation.
Yeah. So trauma is, like I said, trauma is an individual's response to an experience. So when you're looking for, maybe a better way to ask would be, what are the indicators of trauma? Like, how do you know if someone
Symptoms.
has experienced trauma? Trauma is any type of experience that rewires our brain, or if you're young, if you're a newborn, young child, toddler, it wires your brain to stay in a fight, flight, or freeze response. It's that primal brain that kicks in
for survival,
and you're in survival mode. That's it. You have no logical thinking, no forward thinking. Even your emotional regulation is completely shut down. I saw a really cool video that described like trauma brain as you've got your thumb, right? And your thumb is your primal brain, everything that does survival, everything that is fight, flight, or freeze when you feel threatened. And then you have your frontal, what is this called?
Prefrontal
cortex.
Yeah.
Your prefrontal cortex, and all of this is your emotional regulation, right? So this is a healthy brain and what we want a brain to look like. But when a person who has been traumatized is triggered, their brain like pops open, and that's when you hear like they flip their lid. Right. So they're all of their emotional regulation goes out the window, and then they're only thinking in survival mode. So when you see people that are have difficulty regulating their emotions, something that we might consider small, like, oh, that's not a big deal. Why are you responding this way? Because this is not a big deal. Or it feels irrational to us, or it feels illogical. Or maybe it just feels wrong. Like whatever this person is thinking right now is absolutely incorrect. Like I know an individual that is just constantly in a place of thinking, I am worthless and everybody hates me. So she operates out of this space of, well, everybody hates me. Therefore, if you were to, I don't know, said, hey, as a parent, you're like,
nice shoes. They just think I said that sarcastically.
Right. Like, hey, I think you should wash your shoes today. I think your shoes are getting a little dirty. I think you should wash them today. Her brain is telling her, well, she hates me because that's what my trauma has taught me. My trauma has taught me that everybody hates me. So she hates me, and therefore she's attacking me for something that I have. And you'll see a response out of that is anger or defensiveness, or you say that to any other person, it's like, well, just wash your shoes. Like, what's the big deal here? Just wash your shoes and we'll be fine. But to someone who has experienced trauma in that way, small things become a threat to who they are.
It's almost like something, like a load-bearing wall that's been hit so many times that something that hits it like delicately would still collapse it. Right. So the same way someone that's been traumatized has been traumatized by valid things, but something that's not that big of a deal could collapse them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
We talk about fight, flight, or freeze.
Which I think there's a couple more now.
Fawn.
Right?
Yeah.
It's fawn and something else.
Fawn's a new one that people have been talking about, which I think is really interesting.
That's where you give control, submit control, and then I don't know if there's another.
One therapist has described it as, when you're living in that part of the brain, think about this situation. Because I think here's the challenge, is that for those of us, and I think this is not to bang on the church. I hope it doesn't come across that way, but it's to make, I say these things to make us better.
We're all family.
Because we're all family. When we grow up in an environment where, you know, it is relatively good for the most part for at least majority of the people, and by majority I'm saying 51%, but you know, it's difficult to look at, and then given the narrative of the scriptures, right? The scriptures would say, well, we, you know, everything was good, man messed it up, now we're all sinful. And so it's like, well, of course we're going to have trauma. We're sinners. And then you think about kind of this old school mentality of, hey, you need to pull yourself out by your bootstraps. You need to man up, which, by the way, when we say man up, we don't mean that kind of man up. Yeah. But in an older generation, it was like, I don't care about your feelings. I need you to perform. Yeah. And so get up and knock yourself, you know, knock the dust off your clothes and get back after it. And so there's not a lot of sensitivity towards, and we kind of go, well, that's the result of the fall. That's the result of sin. I need Jesus. Jesus is the way, you know, that I can take care of this. And and then if I'm not acting in the way that I should be acting, you know, it's my fault. I'm to blame, etc. When it comes to trauma, though, that's not it. Like it. So how do we differentiate between like the fall, right, the sinful part of us that is kind of always selfish and bent on me, versus these things that are truly traumatic? And I think abuse plays a lot of part in that, but like how do we differentiate between the two? Because I think some of the kickback from what I've seen some people online and others, you know, on podcasts, is they'll say, well, you know, trauma, that's just an excuse to, you know, be able to do whatever you want. So just blame it on the trauma, you know. How do we respond to that?
I think there's two different perspectives here that you're asking about. One, how do we respond to the person who has experienced horrific things and been taken advantage of and abused, who is using trauma as a crutch for how they currently sin, right? And the other perspective is, how do we respond to others who are trying to figure out how to work with or be in relationship with a person who has these traumatic responses? To the first, I would say, if you're speaking to a person, or we're trying to figure out where's the line here between sin and a trauma response. I don't think that I can give an absolute definition on that. That wouldn't be fair for me to peer into the soul of somebody else. But I do think that especially Paul in scriptures speaks very clearly on the hope of restoration and new life, regardless of prior circumstances in life. I think that I preach this to my kids all the time. Something that's really prevalent in people who have experienced intense trauma, ongoing chronic trauma, not like a one instance, like I got into a car accident type of thing, but I'm talking about trauma that has rewired a person's brain. Oftentimes what they experience is what we call in the clinical world thought errors. So the way that they are thinking, their thoughts are literally wrong. They are incorrect, and they go against what we all see as reality, or what we recognize as reality. And I think it's so cool how scripture diagnoses these things and then treats these things far before scientists ever did, far before the 80s when all of this PTSD work started coming out. Paul talks about taking every thought captive to obedience to Christ. Like every single thought, he recognized that our behaviors and our sin starts with our thinking. And the way to treat that, his treatment for it, is taking every single thought captive in obedience to Christ. Obedience is the treatment for these thought errors. And even thinking about the renewal of your mind. Ephesians talks about taking off your old self and putting on Christ. So to use your prior trauma as a crutch is invalid, you know? Certainly we will struggle, and certainly for all of us, we're going to act in ways and behave in ways and do things that are sinful and that we're not proud of. So this is not a speech of hopelessness. If you're struggling with trauma, then you're sinning. That's not what I'm saying. But there is hope in it. Mm-hmm. Of like, hey, I have one of my girls tells me I can't help it. Like, I just can't help it. What a powerless thing to think, and what a powerless thing to believe. And I feel like that is just such the work of the enemy, to make someone believe that because of their prior experiences in life that they now have no power over how they think and behave. And Christ says the complete opposite. Yeah. He says, no, you can overcome. You can rewire your brain, quite literally. Yeah. There is neuroplasticity. I created neuroplasticity. Yeah. I think, and for those who aren't familiar with that term, it is a newer discovery in psychology that our brains can quite literally rewire themselves throughout our entire lives to learn new ways of thinking, to learn new ways of behaving. And I just thought, when I learned about it, I thought it was so cool that although sin came into the world, which created abuse and trauma and all of these horrific things, God already prepared our minds for healing and restoration. He already gave the antidote to trauma, and that is that our brains can relearn how to think and feel in the way that he designed them to.
Wow. There's so much good stuff in there.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out where I want to go next.
One of my things is, like, I think would you say the dangerous part right now in the church is there's a fragile space where, like, we can swing the pendulum too far when it comes to psychology and science, where we overdo trauma, similar to like what Abigail Schreier's starting to talk about. She's like been on the Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson podcast, and she talks about like focusing on our past issues. She's kind of like on the opposite side of the spectrum of Body Keeps a Score. Okay. And then you have the people that don't want to talk about it at all. How do you navigate that being in your space, right? Like, is there situations where you look at and you say like, no, you're not someone that necessarily went through trauma or have it, but that you need to start learning how to move forward?
Well, I think you can swing the pendulum too far in any direction. Of course. I'm not, I don't think I would never tell someone you have not experienced trauma. Okay. That is not for me as an outsider to decide. For sure. Now, if someone has experienced something that I would not perceive as trauma, well, maybe I just have different protective factors in my life that would keep me from being affected by that situation. But for some people, in the way that they were designed and the certain environment that they grew up in, whatever the case is, I think that is up to the individual to define what is traumatizing to them. Now, the slippery slope that I think you're referencing is when does that become a crutch and an excuse and something that a person can just continue to perseverate on without moving forward? And I think really what we're looking at here is, how do you continue to become sanctified? Like, that's the goal, is to be sanctified, to be like Christ, to be set apart and be holy. That is the goal here.
That's good.
So if you are focusing on and just dwelling in the trauma, are you really moving forward in sanctification? Can you do both? Yeah. There is absolutely health in reflecting on trauma, for sure. Understanding why do I think like this? What made me this way? Asking yourself reflective questions. But those questions are most healthy when they are done with the intent of, how then do I use that information to be like Christ?
That's good. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, moving forward seems to be an important piece. Like, I know I'll tell some of the boys we work with and young men, like, your past is not your fault, but your future is your responsibility, right? So it's like, there is this piece of, you've got to do both. You do have to kind of look, because if you don't, you're kind of flying blind, I think. And can you make too much of your past? I think we would all agree you probably can, and that's where it's dangerous.
Yeah.
But that's the difference that Christianity offers. It's the difference that Christ offers, right? Because he's willing to take all that on. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to solve it all with psychology, you are going to go down so many rabbit holes and put yourself in a mental pretzel, I think, eventually. Whereas Christ offers you talked about it earlier, freedom and hope and things that, I was just listening to this guy, man, you would know him. He was in jail, and I mean, his whole face.
Alan would know him because he was in jail. That's what you started with.
I really kind of backfired on me there.
Do y'all want to hear more of that conversation? Well, you can by becoming a Patros subscriber. You'll get exclusive member-only content. Just go to the link in the description or go to the Patros website.
Yeah, and when you become a subscriber, like what you're telling us is that you enjoy this content and you want to hear more of it. So every dollar that you give helps us do just that.
So thank you again for listening as we just together go on this journey of embracing healthy masculinity.